A widow with nothing left to lose, a rancher who had already given up, and a marriage that was never supposed to mean anything, until it meant everything. No one in Trestle Creek expected Rowena Pike to last a single winter. She arrived with 2 bags, a dead husband's debts, and the kind of quiet stubbornness that either saves a person or destroys them. The rancher who sent for her didn't even bother to meet her train. The homestead looked like it was already halfway into the ground, but Rowena had already lost everything once. She wasn't about to let it happen again. If this story speaks to you, hit like and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train platform at Trestle Creek was not much more than a plank of weathered wood and a rusted sign nailed to a post that leaned slightly east, like it had decided long ago that standing straight wasn't worth the effort. Rowena Pike stepped off the train with a canvas bag in each hand and stood in the thin November air, watching the steam curl upward and dissolve into a sky that couldn't decide between gray and white. She counted 7 other passengers who'd disembarked. By the time the conductor blew his whistle and the train lurched forward again, 6 of them had already been collected by someone: a husband, a brother, a hired hand with a wagon. They moved off the platform in pairs and threes, their voices low and familiar, the kind of voices that belong to people who were expected. Rowena was not expected, or rather, she had been expected, and then wasn't. She set her bags down on the planks and waited. 20 minutes. Then 30. The platform emptied. A man in a wool coat walked past without looking at her, his dog at his heels, both of them in a hurry to be somewhere warmer. A woman with a basket of eggs crossed the far end of the street and disappeared around a corner. Rowena looked down at the folded letter in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the crease had gone soft. Brenner Vale, Trestle Creek, Colorado. Fair-tempered man, serious about the arrangement. Ranch needs a capable woman. That was essentially what the correspondence agency had told her. The actual letters from Brenner Vale himself had been fewer. 3 letters in total over 6 weeks, none of them longer than a page. He was not a man who spent much time on words. The last letter had said, "I'll meet the Tuesday train at noon. You'll know me. I'll be the tall one." It was now noon on a Tuesday, and there was no one on the platform at all. She picked her bags back up. There was a general store across the street with a hand-painted sign above the door, and Rowena crossed to it, pushed inside, and was met by the smell of tobacco, dried herbs, and something that might have been bacon grease from the morning. A man behind the counter looked up from a ledger. He had a white mustache and the permanently suspicious expression of someone who'd been shortchanged too many times to assume the best anymore. "Afternoon," Rowena said. "I'm looking for the Vale Ranch. Can you tell me how to get there?" The man's eyebrows moved. "You Brenner Vale's woman?" She didn't particularly like being called that, but she also wasn't in a position to be particular. "I'm Rowena Pike. He was supposed to meet me." Wasn't he? The man said it without a question mark, like the failure didn't surprise him. "Apparently not. So, the ranch." The man, his name turned out to be Gus Aldert, proprietor, as the sign on the wall declared, leaned on the counter and looked at her the way people look at someone they've already decided is going to have a hard time. 4 miles out, northwest. Follow the main road until you see the creek crossing. Take the left fork after that. Look for the fence line with the broken post at the corner. Can't miss it if you know what you're looking for. "And if I don't have a horse?" Gus looked at her bags, then at her, then at the window, where the sky had shifted from undecided to definitely threatening. "I got a mule I can loan you," he said, after a pause that lasted long enough to communicate that this was not something he generally did. "Bring it back tomorrow." "I'll bring it back tomorrow," Rowena said. "Thank you." She tied her bags across the mule's back, climbed on with less grace than she would have liked, and rode northwest out of Trestle Creek on an animal that had its own opinions about pace and direction. The road was rutted and frozen, the kind of cold that got into the seams of your coat and stayed there. She pulled her collar up and kept her eyes on the fence lines. She had not come this far to turn around. She'd been a farmer's wife in Kansas for 11 years. Before that, a farmer's daughter. She knew what struggling land looked like. The particular way it went quiet and thin, the way the buildings started to lean before they started to fall. She'd watched her father lose his place when she was 9, watched her husband lose theirs 4 years after their wedding, watched it happen the second time with more dread because she'd already learned it wasn't something you could stop just by working harder. William Pike had been dead 8 months. Pneumonia in March, fast and final, the kind that gives you a week of fever and then takes everything. He'd left her the house, which went to debt, and the farm, which went to the bank, and a small box of personal effects that she'd packed into the bottom of her canvas bag and hadn't opened since. She wasn't bitter about it. She'd had time to understand that bitterness was a thing that ate your energy and gave you nothing back. What she felt instead was something colder and cleaner, a kind of inventory. She was 34 years old. She had good hands, a working body, and the ability to look at a problem without flinching. She had no money and no property, and no family closer than a cousin in Missouri she hadn't spoken to in 6 years. She'd answered 3 marriage advertisements before Brenner Vales. The first 2 had withdrawn their offers after her letters. She suspected she was too direct, too matter-of-fact, not soft enough in the way she presented herself. The third had turned out to be a man who'd lied about his age by approximately 20 years and had 4 children under 8 who needed raising more than he needed a wife. She'd come home from that meeting and sat at the kitchen table for a long time thinking. Vale's advertisement had been simpler than the others. Ranch in Colorado, mountain country. Looking for a woman who isn't afraid of work. No pretense about it being anything other than what it is. That last line had stayed with her. No pretense about it being anything other than what it is. She could work with that. She found the broken fence post. The Vale Ranch came into view in the late afternoon light, a cluster of low buildings against a hillside. The main house, a 1-story log structure with a stone chimney. There was a barn, smaller than she'd expected, and a chicken coop that listed slightly to one side, and what had once been a kitchen garden, now gone to frost and dead stalks. A split-rail fence ran along the near side of the property, and 2 of the rails had been replaced recently with wood that didn't match, newer, lighter-colored, clearly scavenged from somewhere. There was smoke coming from the chimney. That was something. Rowena rode up to the front of the house and climbed off the mule. She tied it to the post by the porch, a porch that sagged in the middle and had 1 step missing, and stood for a moment looking at the place. There was a feeling she got when she looked at land and buildings that were in trouble, a kind of pressure in the chest that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite dread. More like recognition. She knew this particular kind of tired. She knocked. There was a pause, some movement inside, and then the door opened. The man who appeared in the doorway was tall, like the letter had said. Big through the shoulders, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and eyes that were a shade of blue that looked washed out, like something had bleached the color from them. He was wearing a canvas work coat with a tear at the left elbow, and boots that had been resoled at least once. He looked at her the way people look at something they expected to arrive differently. "You're Rowena Pike," he said. Not a question. "I am," she said. "You didn't come." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "The mayor threw a shoe this morning. By the time It's fine," Rowena said. It wasn't entirely fine, but she wasn't going to stand on a sagging porch in the cold debating it. "The storekeeper loaned me a mule. I need somewhere to put it for the night." Brenner Vale looked at the mule, then at her bags, still tied to its back, then at her face, which she kept carefully neutral. "Come in," he said, stepping back. "I'll see to the mule." The inside of the house was plain and cold in the way that places get when they've been inhabited by only one person for a long time. The furniture was heavy and functional, built for use rather than comfort. A table, 4 chairs, a wood stove that was doing its best but losing ground against the draft that came in from somewhere under the floorboards. There was a bookshelf with 12 volumes, most of them practical. Almanacs, a field medicine guide, something on crop rotation. A single framed photograph on the mantel. A woman and a child, neither of whom were in this house. Rowena stood in the middle of the room and looked at it with the same careful attention she'd given the outside. She could see what was wrong and what could be fixed and what couldn't. The draft from the floor, there were gaps in the chinking, she could feel the cold air moving around her ankles. The stove needed the damper adjusted. The fire was burning too fast. The table had a cracked leg that someone had wrapped with wire, which would hold for a while. The room had the smell of a place that was heated but not quite warm. She put her bags down beside the door. Brenner came back in from outside a few minutes later, stamping his boots on the porch boards. "Mule's in the barn," he said. Feed it in the morning. You can take it back when you go to town. She turned to look at him. When I go to town, for anything you need. He stood in the doorway between the main room and what she assumed was the kitchen, his arms crossed loosely across his chest. He had the bearing of a man who'd been alone long enough to forget how to occupy a room with another person in it. Mr. Vale, Rowena said, I came 4 miles on a borrowed mule in November. I'm not going back to town. He looked at her. I mean, I'll go to town for supplies, she said. But I'm not leaving. That's not what I came here for. Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't have said exactly what it was. He'd been bracing for something, maybe. Some kind of argument or negotiation or disappointment that hadn't arrived. No, he said after a pause. I suppose it isn't. Is there somewhere I can sleep? There's a back room. He moved toward the narrow hallway. It's not much. That's fine. It wasn't much. It was a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out on the side of the barn. The quilt on the bed was thick, but smelled like it had been in a chest too long. The floor was cold. She could see the shapes of mountains through the dirty window glass, going dark against the last of the light. It's fine, Rowena said again, setting her bags on the floor. Brenner stood in the doorway a moment. I'll make supper, he said. I'll help. You don't need to. I want to see the kitchen, she said. I want to see everything. Supper was salt pork, dried beans, and cornbread that was slightly underdone in the middle. Brenner cooked without talking, moving around the small kitchen with the economical gestures of someone who'd learned to do everything himself. Rowena sat at the kitchen table and watched and asked questions. How long since you've had livestock other than the horses and chickens? What's the condition of the well? Do you have any root vegetables stored, or did the garden go under this fall? What's owed on the land? That last one made him stop stirring the beans and look at her. That's a direct question, he said. I need to know what I'm dealing with. He was quiet for a moment, turning the spoon over in his hand. More than I'd like, he said finally. Less than would finish us. If the winter isn't too hard and I can get a decent price for cattle in the spring. How many head? 19. Was 23. Lost 4 to a bad stretch in October. She nodded and wrote something in the small notebook she'd pulled from her bag. He watched her write it down. What are you doing? He said. Keeping track. She didn't look up. You said in your letters the ranch was struggling. I want to understand how and why, so I can figure out what's possible. He put the cornbread in the oven and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. You do this with everything? I do this with problems, Rowena said. It's the only thing that helps. They ate at the kitchen table in the fading light. He hadn't lit the lamp yet, and neither had she, both of them apparently willing to let the dusk run a little longer before spending the oil. The food was plain, and there wasn't enough of it, and the silence between them was the particular kind that exists between two people who don't know each other at all, but have agreed, by coming to this table, to try. I should have been there, Brenner said at one point, without preamble. Rowena looked up. At the station, the mare's shoe. I should have dealt with it the night before. I knew she was favoring that foot. He stared at his beans. It was a bad start. It was, she agreed. But I'm here now. He nodded once, slowly, like he was still processing the fact of it. How long were you married? He asked. Before. 11 years. What happened? Pneumonia. March. She picked up her cornbread, found the underdone middle, set it down. The farm went to debt. I had some time to figure out the next thing, and this was it. You're not... He stopped. What? Nothing. He shook his head. It doesn't matter. You were going to say something. He looked uncomfortable in the way of a man who'd said more than he meant to. You're not what I expected, he said finally. Rowena considered that. What did you expect? Someone quieter, maybe? She almost smiled. I can be quiet. I'm not quiet when there's something I need to know. He was quiet for a moment. Fair enough, he said. Well, she lay in the narrow bed that night and stared at the ceiling and went through what she'd seen and heard and noted down. The picture that assembled itself was not good. The ranch was not in crisis, not yet, but it was close enough that she could feel the edge of it, the way you feel the edge of a cliff when you get too close, even in the dark. The chickens were underproducing, which likely meant something wrong with their feed or their housing. The barn was cold and drafty in ways that cost more than heat, cost energy from the animals, cost weight from the cattle, cost production from everything. The kitchen garden had been abandoned mid-season, which meant there was no stored produce beyond what Brenner had managed to put by in the root cellar, and from what she'd seen, it wasn't much. The fence line on the north side had gaps. The roof on the chicken coop needed attention before hard winter arrived. None of it was unfixable. That was what she kept coming back to. None of it was beyond fixing. It was just beyond fixing by one man doing everything alone. She thought about Brainerd Vale's face across the table. The particular kind of tired that lived in it. Not the tiredness of a hard day, but the tiredness of a long year, or maybe longer than that. The photograph on the mantel. The woman and the child. She hadn't asked about that, and she wasn't going to. Not yet. There were some things that needed time before they were ready to be spoken. She thought about William, not with the sharp ache of the first months that had worn down to something duller and more manageable, something she could carry without it slowing her stride. She thought about the last good year on the Kansas farm, when the rye had come in strong, and they'd paid down a chunk of the debt, and for a little while it had felt like maybe the thing would hold. The way William had stood at the edge of the field in the August light, looking at what they'd done, and said, "It's not so bad, Ro. It's not so bad." He'd always been a man who could find the best angle on a bad situation. She was not naturally that kind of person. She was, by nature, a cataloger of problems. It was useful, more useful than optimism in the long run, but it also meant she lay awake at night counting things. She was counting now. She got up at some point and added a note to her list. Talk to Gus Aldert about what's available and what credit looks like. Then she got back in bed and pulled the thick, slightly musty quilt up to her chin and lay there until the cold in the room started to ease. She was awake before dawn. There was no particular alarm and no particular reason. She'd always been this way, up with the dark, something in her that couldn't stay still while the world was waiting to start. She dressed in the cold of the back room, finding her warmest things by feel, and went into the kitchen to build up the fire. The stove was easier to manage once she'd adjusted the damper, and within 20 minutes the kitchen was warmer than it had been the night before. She found the coffee, such as it was. The tin was more than half empty, which went on the list, and put a pot on and stood at the kitchen window while it heated, looking at the shape of the land in the pre-dawn dark. The mountains were black silhouettes against a sky that was just beginning to separate from night. There was snow on their high slopes, blue-white and still. Closer in, the ranch lay quiet, the barn, the coop, the broken fence along the north field. A pale light was coming, slow and serious, the way November light came. Like it wasn't sure it had enough warmth to offer and wanted to be careful about promising what it couldn't deliver. Rowena stood at that window for a long time. She was not, by habit, a woman given to emotional states about landscape. She'd grown up in a flat country where the sky was the whole scene, not the mountains. But something about this place in the early morning, with its obvious difficulties and its obvious bones, settled something in her that had been unsettled for 8 months. She had a lot of work to do. That was a good feeling, strangely. She'd been adrift in the particular directionlessness of loss, in the gap between what she'd had and what came next, and now there was a next. It was harder than she'd hoped and colder than she'd imagined, and she was sleeping in a strange room next to a stranger, but there was a next. She heard him before she saw him, his boots on the hall floor, the sound of a man who moved carefully in his own house like he was still remembering how to take up space in it. Brenner came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her standing at the window with the coffee pot behind her. "You're up," he said. "I'm always up?" She turned to get him a cup. "The damper was off. I adjusted it." He looked at the stove. "I've had it that way for a year," he said, but not defensively, more like he was telling her something he hadn't examined. "It's burning too fast. You're losing heat." She handed him the cup. "Coffee's weak. You're running low on the tin." "I know. I'll add it to the list." He took the coffee and drank some and looked at the list, which was on the table now, 3/4 of a page in her small, exact handwriting. He didn't pick it up or reach for it, just looked at it from where he stood. "What else is on there?" he said. "Chickens need better feed. The coop wall on the north side has a gap. The root cellar, I didn't go in last night, but I need to see what's there. The floor in the main room, there are gaps in the chinking. Do you have any stores of straw? Good quality, not the wet stuff? He blinked. Some, in the barn. If we pack it against the north foundation of the coop before the real cold comes, it'll help the chickens keep their production up. They stop laying when they're too cold, but they'll keep going if they're not spending all their energy on warmth. Brenner was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What? She said. Nothing. He shook his head just slightly. Where did you learn that? Kansas, she said. My father had chickens. My mother kept chickens. I've kept chickens. She set the notebook down. What do you usually do in the mornings before breakfast? He blinked again and then seemed to collect himself. Water the stock, check the horses. I'll start on breakfast. You tell me what you have and I'll figure out what to make. He told her, dried beans, some salt pork, a small amount of flour, half a jar of last year's preserves. Apple, he thought. Some oats. Oats, she said. That's enough. She made oatmeal with the apple preserves stirred in, and it was not fancy, but it was hot, and there was enough of it, and she could see when Brenner came back in from the barn that he ate it differently than he'd eaten the salt pork the night before. Not just from hunger, but from something else, some small animal relief at being fed something that tasted like it had been made with attention. He didn't say anything about it, but he finished the bowl, and then he looked at her over the empty dish, and there was something in the look that was different from the night before, when he'd been braced and careful and not quite sure what to do with her. I should show you the rest of the place today, he said. Yes, Rowena said. You should. He showed her everything. The barn first. She walked the length of it with her hands in her pockets, looking at the roof, the walls, the floor. The cattle were thin but not desperate. The two horses were in better condition, which told her something about Brenner's priorities that she filed away without judgment. There was a stack of winter hay that she measured with her eyes and knew, without asking, was not going to be enough. You'll need more hay, she said. I know. What's the cost per bale from Aldert? He told her, and she wrote it down. The chicken coop was worse than she'd thought from the outside. The north wall gap was wide enough to get her hand through, and there were only 11 hens, 4 of whom had the dull-eyed, ruffled look of birds that weren't quite well. She picked one up. It didn't resist, which was part of the problem, and checked its crop and its feet. Mites, she said. Possibly. I need to look closer, but see the way she's holding her wings? And the one in the corner, she hasn't laid in a while. Brenner looked at the hen in her hands. I didn't know to look for that. Most people don't, unless someone showed them. She put the bird down. It's fixable, cheap to fix mostly. Wood ash in the coop, clean the bedding, get them somewhere they can dust bathe even in winter. I'll need to look at their feed. What are you giving them? Cracked corn. That's all? Yes. She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it because there was no point. She just wrote it down. The kitchen garden was what she'd expected. Gone for the winter, the soil turned over roughly. The bed showing the shape of a plan that had probably been better 2 or 3 years ago before whatever happened that made one person doing the work of 2 feel insufficient. She stood in the garden beds with the wind coming off the mountains and thought about what could go in early spring, what the soil needed, what the season would allow. It was my wife's garden, Brenner said from behind her. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the path, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the dead beds. His face was doing something complicated that he wasn't particularly trying to hide and wasn't particularly showing either, just letting it be what it was. I'm sorry, Rowena said. How long ago? 3 years. He looked at the garden a moment longer. Margaret and our son, Daniel. Fever. It came through the valley in '85. He stopped. Then, I kept the photograph on the mantle. I saw it. He nodded once. I wasn't going to explain it unless you asked. You don't have to explain anything to me, she said. It's your house. He looked at her then, and she met the look steadily. There was something in the air between them. Not grief exactly, but the presence of it, the way it makes a space around itself. She'd lost William 8 months ago. She understood something about what it felt like to stand somewhere that had been organized around another person's life. I'm not trying to replace her, Rowena said quietly. It needed to be said, and so she said it. That's not what I'm here for. Brenner was quiet for a long moment. I know that, he said. I know that. Odds. In the afternoon, she went through the root cellar with a lantern. It was not as bad as she'd feared, which was something. There were beets, turnips, some winter squash, a few crates of apples. Not enough for a whole winter, but not nothing. She counted and made notes and came back up into the thin winter light blinking. Brenner was splitting wood by the barn. He'd been at it since after the tour. She'd watched him out the kitchen window for a while, the rhythm of it, the particular way he worked that was very efficient and very repetitive, the kind of work you could do while your mind was somewhere else. She brought him a cup of water and stood nearby while he stopped for it. "The root cellar is thin," she said. "Not empty, but thin. If winter runs long, I know." "You say that a lot." He looked at her, the tin cup in his hand. "Because I do know. I know everything that's wrong with this place. I just—" He stopped. "Couldn't fix it all yourself," she said. "No." The word landed simply, without drama. She thought it probably cost him something, saying it. "You can't," she said. "That's not a failure. It's arithmetic. Two people can do what one person can't. That's all this is." He looked at the cup. Then he set it down on the stack of wood and picked up the axe again. "The account at Aldert's," he said, not looking at her. "There's not much room in it." "How much room?" He told her. She did the arithmetic quickly, against what she'd seen and what she knew about winter costs and what he'd told her about the cattle sale in spring. The margin was thin, thinner than she'd hoped. "All right," she said. "All right?" He looked at her. "I've worked with less," she said. "We need to be careful about what we spend between now and March. But it's possible." He looked at her for a long moment. The axe was loose in his hand, the blade pointed at the ground. There was something in his face that she couldn't quite name. It was close to relief. But relief had an ease to it that this didn't. This was more like the first breath after holding it for too long. "You're not afraid of it," he said. "Of being poor." She almost laughed. Not a mean laugh, just the genuine surprise of the question. "Mr. Vale, I've been poor most of my adult life. It's not comfortable, but it's not new." He was quiet, and then he said, "Brenner." She looked at him. "Call me Brenner," he said. "Mr. Vale is—" He shook his head slightly. "We're living in the same house. Mr. Vale is too much." "Brenner?" she said, testing it. He picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood. She went back inside to start supper, and the wood split behind her in an even rhythm, and the smoke from the chimney went up into the early dark of the Colorado November, and somewhere in the mountains a wind was building that would reach the valley by morning. She had a lot of work to do. She was, for the first time in 8 months, not afraid of that. The wind reached the valley before dawn, the way Rowena had known it would. She heard it first in her sleep, a low sound at the edges of the house, feeling for gaps, finding the ones she'd already noted in her list. By the time it was fully dark to gray outside, the temperature inside the main room had dropped enough that she could see her breath when she got up to rebuild the fire. She stood at the stove in her coat and wool socks, feeding split wood into the box, listening to the house adjust itself around the cold the way old structures do, creaking and settling, the walls doing what they could. Brenner was already gone when she came into the kitchen. His coat was off the hook by the door, his boots missing from the mat. Through the kitchen window, she could see the barn door standing open, a lantern light moving inside. She put the coffee on and started on what there was for breakfast. More oats, a small piece of salt pork she stretched across the bottom of the pan, the last of the apple preserves scraped from the jar. While it cooked, she stood at the list she'd made the night before and added 2 things: window glazing, south kitchen window, draft. And then below it, check coop birds again, cold snap will hit them hard. She'd brought the sick hen inside the night before. She hadn't asked Brenner about it. She'd just done it, settling the bird in a wooden box near the stove with some clean straw and a little water. When Brenner came in from the barn, stamping the cold off his boots, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the box. "Is that my chicken?" he said. She was too cold in the coop. She wouldn't have made it through the night. He looked at the hen, which looked back at him with the resigned expression of a sick animal that has stopped being surprised by its circumstances. Then he looked at Rowena. "All right," he said, and hung up his coat. That was one of the things she was starting to understand about Brenner Vale. He didn't argue when something was clearly right. He might take a moment with it, might give her a look that weighed the situation, but if the logic held, he didn't put up a fight just to assert himself. It was not a small thing. She'd known men who would have argued about the chicken on principle. They ate breakfast mostly in silence, which had already started to feel less uncomfortable than it had the first night. Silence between strangers is a different animal than silence between people who have at least established the basics of each other. And they were establishing, slowly, meal by meal, task by task, the beginning of a working knowledge of who they were dealing with. "I want to go to Aldert's today," Rowena said, when the oats were done and the coffee was down to its last inch. "Get a look at what's available and what it costs. Figure out what we need most before the real cold settles in." Brenner turned his cup on the table. "The account there." "I know what the account is." She said it without sharpness. "I'm not going to spend anything today. I'm going to look." He nodded. "Is the mare fit to ride?" she asked. "She'll be fine. Shoes fixed." He paused. "I can go with you." "You don't have to." "There's a fence post on the north line that needs tending before the ground freezes hard. I was going to get to it this morning." He said this like it was an explanation, not an excuse. "But I can go to town with you." Rowena looked at him. He wasn't offering company, exactly. She could see he wasn't a man who offered company easily. He was checking on her in the careful, indirect way of someone who didn't want to be seen doing it. "Fix the fence post," she said. "I'll manage Aldert's." Something in his posture eased just slightly. She rode back into Trestle Creek on the same mule, which had opinions about the cold and shared them by moving at its own pace regardless of what her heels said. The town was small, a main street with maybe a dozen buildings, 2 of which appeared to be saloons, 1 church, a livery, and Aldert's general store at the east end. There was a blacksmith she could hear before she could see it, the sound of hammer on iron carrying in the cold air. Gus Aldert was behind the counter when she came in, and a woman was with him, his wife, turned out. A compact person named Vera, with gray-streaked hair and the look of someone who ran the actual operation while Gus managed the ledger. Rowena had met women like Vera before. She liked them immediately on principle. "Vale's woman," Gus said by way of greeting. "Rowena Pike," she said, for the second time pleasantly. Vera gave her husband a brief look and came around the end of the counter. "Coffee?" she said. "We keep a pot on." "Thank you." She took the coffee and walked the store with it, looking at everything. The Alderts watched her do it. Gus with his ledger man's wariness, Vera with something more like assessment. Rowena looked at the feed prices, the hardware section, the small corner of fabric and household goods, the preserved foods, the seed packets that were already up for the following spring. She looked at the prices on everything and kept the numbers. It was not encouraging. The cost of feed had gone up since fall. She could tell by the slight unevenness of the price markings, newer figures written over older ones. The corn was affordable enough, but not excellent quality. The oats were better, but priced higher than she'd expected. She found wood ash listed as free with purchase of certain goods, which she made a note of immediately. "You're looking at everything," Vera said, appearing at her elbow. "Trying to understand what things cost out here," Rowena said. "It's different from Kansas." "Everything's different from Kansas." Vera said it without unkindness. "What brings you to it?" "To Brenner's place, I mean." It was a direct question, asked directly. Rowena had learned that the best response to directness was more directness. "Marriage correspondence," she said. "Answered his advertisement." Vera looked at her steadily. "And I arrived yesterday and he didn't meet my train, but the ranch needs work and so do I, so here I am." Vera Aldert was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Brenner's not a bad man. He's had a hard few years." "I can see that." "Margaret was—" Vera paused. "She and I were friends since before she came here. What happened to her and the boy was very hard." Rowena nodded. She didn't push for more. It wasn't her story to know yet. "He advertised twice before," Vera said, more quietly. "Both women came, looked at the place, and left inside a week." Rowena looked at her over the rim of the coffee cup. "I'm not leaving," she said. Vera studied her for another moment. Then she nodded, once, like something had been settled. "Come look at the seed section," she said. "I'll tell you what does well in this valley." Oh. She learned more from an hour with Vera Aldert than she might have learned from a week of her own observation. The valley had a shorter growing season than Kansas by about 3 weeks, but the soil was richer in the lower fields, and the creek provided reliable water if you managed it right. Beans did well, squash did well, potatoes were the thing. The Alderts grew their own and sold seed, and Vera told her what varieties held through the mountain winters, and which ones were a waste of effort. The chickens, Vera's eyes sharpened at the mention of them, needed supplemental feed, not just cracked corn, and there was a particular mix of grain and greens that kept production up through the cold months. Wood ash and dried herbs for the mites, Vera said, and separate the sick birds until you're sure. I already brought one inside. Vera smiled briefly. It changed her face entirely. Good. On her way out, Rowena stopped at the counter and looked at Brenner's account in the ledger that Gus turned without being asked for her to see. He didn't say why he showed her. Maybe he'd decided, watching her walk the store and take her notes, that she was someone who could handle the information. Maybe Vera had signaled something she hadn't caught. The number was what Brenner had told her. She looked at it a long time, doing the arithmetic again in her head. Hay cost, feed cost, the fence supplies, the winter ahead. Then she looked at her own list of purchases and crossed off 4 items. Not the chicken feed supplement that she kept, not the wood ash arrangement, but the extra flour, the good coffee, the tin of lamp oil she'd been considering, those came off. She could do without good coffee. The chickens could not do without feed. Tell him the account's fine, she said to Gus, because she knew Brenner would ask when the next bill came due. Tell him I was careful. Gus wrote something in the ledger. Yes, ma'am, he said, which was the first time anyone in Trestle Creek had called her that, and she found she didn't mind it. She got back to the ranch in early afternoon to find Brenner at the north fence line, exactly where he'd said he'd be. She could see him from the road, a dark figure against the white-gray of the frozen field, working a post back into the iron-hard ground with a mallet that wasn't quite heavy enough for the job. She stopped the mule and watched for a moment. He'd been at it a while. She could tell by the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of labor that's gone past the point of ease and settled into something more like stubbornness. The post wasn't going in cleanly. The ground had already started to freeze deep, and every strike of the mallet gave back more than it took. But he wasn't stopping. She rode the mule up along the fence line until she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. Needs a heavier mallet, she said. He looked up. His face was red from the cold, and there was a look in his eyes that she was starting to recognize. The particular exhausted determination of a man who'd decided not to stop until the thing was done, regardless of what it cost him. I know, he said. Is there one in the barn? He paused. There might be. In the back, on the left side. Old one with a cracked handle. A cracked handle still swings, she said, and turned the mule toward the barn. She found the mallet. It was old, the handle wrapped in twine at the crack to keep it from splitting further, but the head was heavy and sound. She brought it back out and handed it down from the mule without ceremony, and he took it, tested the weight, and went back to the post. It went in on the 4th strike. He stood back and looked at it. Then he set the mallet against the fence and rubbed his right hand against his coat. She could see from the way he held it that the cold had gotten into his fingers. How was Alderts? He said. Useful. Vera showed me the seed section. She paused. I looked at the account. He didn't say anything. It's all right, she'd said. We're going to be careful, but it's manageable. She didn't tell him about what she'd crossed off the list. It didn't need to be said. It would just sit between them as an obligation, and she didn't want that. She'd made the choice, and she was satisfied with it. He picked up the mallet and started toward the barn. She rode alongside him, the mule plodding philosophically through the frozen grass. Vera said Margaret was a friend of hers, Rowena said after a moment. Brenner's pace didn't change, but something in the quality of his silence did. They were close, he said, since before we came out here. She told me what happened. I'm sorry. He nodded. They walked, rode, in silence for a while. I wasn't going to get involved with this place again, he said, eventually. It came out like something he'd been carrying for a while and had decided to put down, not because it was time exactly, but because the weight had become inconvenient. After the first 2 women came and left, I thought, that's probably the answer. Just run the place as long as I can, and then... He stopped. And then what? I don't know. He said it without self-pity. It was just honest. I hadn't gotten that far. Rowena considered this. Why did you advertise? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Vera, he said finally. She said it wasn't right letting the place go. That Margaret would have... He stopped again. I don't know. She pushed me to try again. I'm not sure I believed it would work. It's working, Rowena said. He looked up at her on the mule. There was something almost surprised in the look, like he'd expected her to hedge or qualify. She hadn't, because there was no point. It was working. They had 2 days behind them and a lot of winter ahead, but things were already different than they'd been, and she could feel it. He didn't say anything, but he held the barn door open for the mule, and she took that as acknowledgement. The sick hen died 2 days later. Rowena found her in the box by the stove in the morning, still and small, the way sick animals go when they go. Without fuss, without drama, just a quieting. She wrapped the bird in burlap and set her outside. And when Brenner came in for breakfast, she told him matter-of-factly, and he nodded and ate his oatmeal and didn't say much. But later she found that he'd buried the hen near the old garden beds rather than tossing her in the waste pile, and she didn't mention it because it didn't need mentioning. The remaining 10 hens she treated over the course of 3 days: wood ash in the bedding, a thorough cleaning of the coop floor, the gap in the north wall stuffed with packed straw, and a board she found in the barn. She started the supplemental feed mix that Vera had described, a combination of cracked grains and dried greens from the kitchen. By the end of the week, 2 of the dull-eyed birds were looking sharper, their combs brighter, moving around with more intention. You got 4 eggs this morning, Brenner said, coming in one midweek afternoon. How many were you getting before? He thought about it. 1, sometimes 2. Last week I got none. Give it another week, she said. He set the eggs on the counter carefully. 4 eggs was not a dramatic number, but in the context of the ranch's margins, 4 eggs a day was the difference between a household that was feeding itself and one that wasn't. She could see him doing the same arithmetic. It was a small thing, but she noticed that he looked at the eggs for a moment before he went to wash up. The same look she'd seen in the field with the fence post. The look of a man who was getting used to something working out instead of not. That was how the first week went. Not dramatically, nothing was solved and nothing was finished, and every day turned up 2 new problems for everyone that got crossed off the list. The floor chinking, she packed herself with a clay mixture she found reference to in one of the almanacs on the shelf. It wasn't perfect, but it was better, and the main room held its heat noticeably longer after the stove was stoked. She reorganized the root cellar so that the items most likely to spoil came out first, extending the life of what they had. She found 3 bags of seed in the barn that Brenner hadn't mentioned, good squash seed, still viable, and added them to the spring column in her notebook. Brenner, for his part, did not slow down. Whatever reserve of energy he'd been running on before she arrived, he was running on more of it now, or maybe the nature of the work had shifted slightly, gotten a different quality when there were 2 people doing it instead of 1. She'd noticed this on the Kansas farm. Work shared doesn't just have the labor. It changes the character of it. You're not carrying it alone, and that changes something in the body, some weight in the shoulders that isn't about muscle. He was out before her most mornings. He came in for meals and ate them fully, which she took as a sign that she was feeding him better than he'd been feeding himself. He didn't offer a lot of conversation, but he wasn't unforthcoming either. When she asked questions about the land or the cattle or the history of a particular fence line, he answered. When she told him what she'd found or figured out, he listened without interrupting. Once, on the 4th evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook, and he came in from outside and stood by the stove, warming his hands, and looked at her for a moment. "What are you writing?" he said. "Spring plans." She looked up. "Is it all right if I do that?" Something crossed his face that she couldn't quite read. It was complicated, whatever it was, carrying several things at once. "It's all right," he said. She went back to writing. He made himself coffee and stood at the window and didn't say anything else. But he didn't leave the kitchen, either. And after a while, the silence was the kind that has something almost companionable in it. Like 2 people who have quietly agreed that they can occupy the same space without it needing to mean more than it means right now. Ishin. She found the photograph on the mantel every morning when she came into the main room to build the fire. She didn't avoid looking at it, and she didn't stare. Margaret Vale had been a handsome woman. You could see that, even in the flat sepia of the photograph, with dark hair and a forthright look about her. The boy, Daniel, couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 in the picture. He had Brenner's jaw, she thought. Or maybe that was just the wish to find something recognizable. She thought about William on those mornings. Not miserably. She'd made her peace with grief, as much as you ever do, and she didn't think he'd want her standing in a cold room feeling bad about a life she was trying to make. But she thought about him in the particular way you think about someone who shaped you, who was part of the person you became, and who wasn't coming back. William would have liked this valley, she thought. He would have looked at the mountains and said something practical about snowmelt and growing seasons, and then he would have smiled that slow smile of his. She didn't tell Brenner any of this. It wasn't the time, and it wasn't perhaps something he needed, but she thought about it. One night, a week after her arrival, she was in the kitchen after supper when Brenner came in from checking the barn and stopped just inside the door. There was something in his posture, a tension that wasn't from the cold. "What's wrong?" she said. He shook his head. "One of the cattle, the younger heifer, she's been off her feed." "Since when?" "Noticed it this morning, hoped it was nothing." "And now?" He looked out the window toward the dark barn. "Now I'm less sure." He pulled his coat back on. "I'm going to sit with her a while. Make sure she doesn't go down tonight." Rowena looked at the hour. It was well past dark, past what she'd call a reasonable time for anyone to be sitting in a cold barn. "I'll come." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said, already reaching for her coat. "She's one of 19, and 19 is not enough margin to lose one if we can help it." He didn't argue. The barn was cold and smelled of hay and animals, which was a particular smell she'd known her whole life, and found, oddly, steadying. The heifer was in the back stall, young, maybe 2 years old, and clearly uncomfortable, her sides drawn in slightly, her eyes showing white around the edges. Rowena crouched down beside her and ran her hands along the animal's flank, feeling for heat, for rigidity, for the signs she knew to look for. "She's not twisted," she said, "and she's not running a fever that I can feel. Might be something she ate. Might be stress from the cold snap." "Might be," Brenner said. He was crouched on the other side, his hand on the heifer's neck. "We watch her tonight. If she's not worse by morning, she's probably going to be all right." He nodded. They settled in, Rowena on an overturned bucket, Brenner on a hay bale, the lantern between them and the heifer in the stall behind. It was cold enough that they could see their breath, and the wind was back, finding the gaps in the barn boards and sliding through in thin, cold ribbons. Outside, the November dark was complete and enormous, the kind of dark that only happens in country this far from anything, where there's no ambient glow from a city somewhere on the horizon, just stars and the dark and the mountains going on and on. They didn't talk for a while. Then Brenner said, without looking at her, "You know a lot about animals." "I know enough," Rowena said. "I'm not a vet, but I've watched enough sick ones to know what serious looks like and what doesn't." "And this?" "This doesn't. Not yet." He was quiet again. The heifer shifted and blew out a long breath, and Rowena watched her sides, checking the rhythm. "My father lost his whole herd once," Brenner said. "It came out of the dark the way some things do. Not dramatically, just dropped into the silence because the silence had made room for it. I was maybe 12. Fever went through the valley. 40 head. He never really recovered from it, financially. We had to sell most of the land." "What happened to him?" "He moved east. My mother wanted to go back to Ohio. He went with her." He paused. He wasn't unhappy there. He found other work, but he wasn't the same." Rowena understood what he was saying, under what he was saying. A man can survive losing the land and still lose himself in the process. "Is that what you're afraid of?" she said. Not unkindly, just asking what needed asking. The lantern threw yellow light across his face. He looked at the heifer for a long moment. "Maybe," he said. "You're not going to lose this place," Rowena said. "You don't know that." "No," she said. "But I know that the difference between losing it and not losing it is mostly going to be whether we work smart and don't give up. And I don't intend to give up." She shifted on the bucket. It was not a comfortable seat. So, he looked at her then. In the lantern light he looked tired, but it was a different tired than she'd first seen in him. Less the tiredness of a man who's running out of reason to try, and more the tiredness of a man who's been at something hard all day and is going to be at it again tomorrow. "You're very certain," he said. It wasn't a criticism. "I'm not certain," she said. I'm just not going to act like I'm not certain, because that doesn't help anything." He made a sound that might have been almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. The first time she'd heard anything like it from him. The heifer got up at some point around midnight, slow and uncertain, and drank from the water bucket. Rowena watched her do it and felt the particular satisfaction of something going the right way. "She'll be fine," she said. Brenner stood and stretched, and they walked back to the house in the cold dark, the snow crunching under their boots, the stars overhead so thick and close they seemed like something you could reach up and rearrange. At the door he stopped and said quietly, "Thank you for staying up." "She's part of the ranch," Rowena said. "So am I." She went inside and went to bed, and lay in the dark listening to the wind settle, and thought about how strange and particular life was, that she'd come to a strange place with 2 bags and a borrowed mule, and somehow, somewhere in the space of 8 days, it had started to feel less like arriving and more like returning to something she hadn't known she was looking for. The heifer recovered, which was the first thing. She was back on feed by the second morning, moving around her stall with the slightly indignant air of an animal that has been watched too closely and would prefer some privacy. Rowena checked her over once more in the early light, running her hands along the flank, checking the eyes, and declared her sound. Brenner, who'd gone out before breakfast to look, came back in and said nothing, but he ate his oats that morning with the particular appetite of a man who'd had something to worry about and now didn't. Small victories on a struggling ranch had a specific weight to them. Rowena had learned this years ago in Kansas, that on land already working against you, the thing that didn't go wrong was sometimes as important as the thing that went right. The heifer staying on her feet was 19 head of cattle instead of 18, which was the difference between a spring sale that might cover the debt and one that definitely wouldn't. She didn't say any of this to Brenner. He was doing the same arithmetic himself. She could see it in his face. The real cold arrived that 3rd week, not the preliminary cold of early November, the kind that reminds you winter is coming, but the actual thing, the settled mountain cold that moved in from the north and stayed. The temperature dropped hard on a Wednesday night and didn't come back up for 4 days. Rowena woke Thursday morning to find the water in the wash basin in her room had a skin of ice on it, and the gap she'd packed in the north wall of the main room had let in enough cold overnight to make her breath visible even in the center of the house. She rebuilt the fire fast and then went to the kitchen and built that one up too, and then she put her coat on over her clothes and went out to the chicken coop while the sky was still the dark gray of early morning before full light to check on the hens. All 10 were alive. The bedding she'd packed tight against the north wall had held. They were huddled together in the way birds do in cold, fluffed up and still. But their eyes were clear, and when she scattered the morning feed, they moved toward it with something like interest. She stood in the coop for a few minutes just watching them, her breath clouding in the cold air, the small sounds of 10 birds eating filling the space around her. Brenner found her there when he came out to do the barn. He stopped at the coop door and looked in. "All 10?" he said. "All 10?" she said. He nodded and went on to the barn. That was its own kind of conversation. The days that followed settled into a pattern that was hard in the particular way of cold weather work. Everything took longer, everything cost more energy. The cold got into the machinery of things and slowed it down. Watering the stock meant breaking ice in the trough each morning. Getting the barn to a temperature that wasn't actively harming the animals meant keeping a second small stove running in there, which cost wood, which cost time spent splitting it. The horses needed extra feed to keep their weight. The cattle needed checking twice a day. Rowena kept her list and crossed things off and added new things and kept the list. It was the only way she knew to stay ahead of a situation that was always trying to get ahead of her. One afternoon, she spent 3 hours in the root cellar reorganizing again, pulling things out, checking every item for spoilage, putting the most vulnerable items in the warmest spots near the interior wall. She found a jar of pickled beets she'd missed in the first inventory, and a small cloth sack of dried apple rings that had been pushed to the very back. Both of those went on the plus side of the ledger in her head. She was coming back up from the cellar when she nearly ran into Brenner on the path between the house and the barn. He caught her by the arm when she stumbled on the frozen ground, just for a second, just enough to steady her, and then let go immediately, both of them stepping back a half step. "Sorry," he said. "My fault," she said. "I wasn't looking." They stood there for a moment in the cold, both of them more aware than they'd been a second before of the fact of the other person, the physical fact of it. Then Rowena held up the jar of pickled beets. "Found these," she said. He looked at the jar. "Margaret put those up. He stopped. 2 summers ago. I forgot they were there." She looked at the jar in her own hand. The beets were dark red, still good-looking through the glass. She thought about saying something and then decided that the simplest thing was the best thing. "They'll go with supper tonight," she said. "Yes," he said. "They will." She went to Aldert's again the following week, this time for actual purchases. The chicken feed supplement she'd been making do without by stretching the existing stores. A small tin of oil for the squealing hinge on the barn door that was losing its battle against the cold. She'd calculated it out 3 times and the numbers agreed. They could afford these things if she skipped 2 other items on the list. She skipped them without difficulty. Vera was alone in the store when she came in. Gus was apparently at the mill on some errand, and the place had a different quality without him. Warmer, somehow, or at least less formal. Vera poured her coffee without being asked, and they stood at the counter while Rowena went through her list. "The supplement mix," Vera said, pulling down a bag from the shelf behind her. "I was wondering when you'd come for this. I saw the difference in your girls when you were in last time." "They're looking better," Rowena agreed. "Production's up to 6 a day now." 6? Vera raised her eyebrows, not dramatically, but with real appreciation. Brenner was getting 1 or 2 all of last winter. "The mites were eating them alive," Rowena said, "and the cracked corn alone isn't enough nutrition when it's this cold. They need more to stay warm." Vera nodded and began weighing out the supplement. "How's he doing?" she said, in the careful neutral tone of someone who's asked this question before and knows it has layers. Rowena considered. "Better," she said. She paused, trying to be accurate. "He'd gotten used to things not working. It takes a while to stop bracing for that." Vera looked at her over the counter. "And you?" "I've been worse off," Rowena said simply. Vera smiled, the real one, the one that changed her whole face. "Yes," she said. "I believe you have." She was weighing out the hinge oil when the door opened and a man came in, heavy set, in a good coat, the kind of coat that cost more than most people in Trestle Creek were spending on coats. He had a neat beard and the bearing of someone who was accustomed to being the most consequential person in whatever room he entered. He looked around the store, his eyes landing briefly on Rowena before moving to Vera. "Vera," he said. "Is Gus in?" "At the mill," Vera said. Her voice had gone a degree flatter. "What do you need, Mr. Croft?" "I'll come back," Croft said. He was already turning to go, but his eyes passed over Rowena again, assessing, cataloging. "You're new," he said, not unpleasantly. "In the valley, I mean." "Arrived last month," Rowena said. "Whose place?" "Vale's." Something shifted in his expression, very small, a recalibration of some kind. "Brenner Vale," he said. "Is he well?" "He's fine," Rowena said. Croft nodded once, the nod of a man filing information away. "Tell him Harlan Croft said hello," he said, and went back out. The door closed. In the silence that followed, Vera set down the oil tin and looked at it for a moment. "Who is that?" Rowena said. "Harlan Croft owns the Croft grazing operation, east side of the valley. Biggest landholder in the county, give or take." Vera's voice was carefully even. "He's been buying up smaller holdings for the last few years, whenever someone gets into trouble and can't hold on." Rowena looked at the closed door. "He's made offers on Brenner's land," she said. Vera didn't answer immediately. Then, "I don't know what conversations they've had, but I know Croft watches when someone's struggling." Rowena put the money on the counter for her purchases and picked up her packages. "I see," she said. She rode back to the ranch thinking about Harlan Croft's eyes passing over her and recalibrating. She thought about what that recalibration meant, what it said about what he'd expected and what he'd found instead. A woman at the Vale Ranch, purchasing chicken feed and hinge oil, knowing what she needed and what she didn't. That was information. She'd seen men like Croft file information, and she knew what they did with it. She didn't say anything to Brenner that evening. She needed to think it through first. What she found, over the next few days of quiet consideration, was that the situation Brenner had told her. Not because he'd been dishonest, she didn't think Brenner Vale was a dishonest man, but there was a way that men in trouble with land and money sometimes didn't fully reckon the numbers because fully reckoning them led somewhere they couldn't afford to look at directly. She did the full reckoning. She sat at the kitchen table one evening after supper with the notebook open and went through everything she knew, what Gus had shown her in the ledger, what Brenner had told her about the cattle sale, what she'd learned from Vera about the cost of feed through winter, what she'd observed about the rate at which they were going through stores. She added in the hay shortfall, which was real and was going to cost. She added in the medicine she needed for the cattle, a small but necessary expense she'd been putting off. When she had it all in front of her, she sat with it for a long time. Brenner was outside doing something to the barn door that had apparently gotten worse since the hinge oil, requiring actual carpentry rather than just lubrication. She could hear the occasional sound of a hammer. She looked at her numbers and she looked at the window and she thought about what was possible and what wasn't. She was still sitting there when he came in. He saw the notebook open on the table and her face, which she realized had probably not been neutral because he stopped in the middle of taking his coat off and looked at her properly. "What is it?" he said. Not a question exactly. She told him. Not dramatically, just clearly. The numbers, what they meant, the margin they were working with, which was smaller than either of them had wanted to believe. She watched his face as she talked. He went through several things. Something that might have been the beginning of argument, something that might have been denial, and then the particular stillness of a man who has decided to stop arguing with arithmetic. "I know," he said when she finished. He sat down across from her. His hands were on the table, rough from the cold and the work, one of the knuckles scraped from the carpentry. "I've known it was close. I thought—" He stopped. "That getting through the winter was the main thing," Rowena said. "And everything after that was after that." "Yes." "That's not wrong," she said. "Getting through the winter is the main thing, but we need to look at what happens after. The cattle sale in spring, if it goes well, yes. If we get a good price and we haven't lost any more head." She kept her voice level. "Brenner, there's a man named Croft who's been watching this land." His face changed, closed down slightly, the way a door closes when a draft comes through. "Harlan Croft," he said. "He came into Alderts when I was there. Vera told me he's been buying up struggling properties." Brenner was quiet for a moment. His hands on the table were still. "He made an offer 2 years ago," he said. "After Margaret and Daniel. I wasn't in a condition to make good decisions, and the offer was decent. Better than what the land was worth in that market." A pause. "I didn't take it." "Why not?" He looked at her. It was a direct look, the most direct he'd given her since she'd arrived. "Because Margaret would have wanted me to hold it," he said. "Because I put everything I had into this land, and I wasn't going to hand it to Harlan Croft because I had a bad year." "Has he approached you since?" "Not formally, but I've seen him at Alderts a few times, making conversation." His jaw tightened slightly. "Harlan Croft doesn't make conversation with people he's not interested in professionally." Rowena nodded. She looked at her numbers. "Then we need the spring sale to go well," she said. "And we need to keep the cattle healthy. And we need to get through winter without spending what we don't have. We've been doing that. We need to keep doing it." She looked at him. "What's the fence situation on the east side, Croft side?" Something moved in his expression. "Some gaps. I've been patching as I can. Because if cattle get onto his land, I know." He said it with more weight than the 2 words warranted. She could see he'd thought about this. A cattle dispute with the biggest landowner in the county was not a fight a struggling ranch could afford, legally or financially. "I'll get to the east fence. I'll help." He looked like he was going to say she didn't need to, and then he didn't say it because by now they both understood that she was going to help with whatever needed doing, and the discussion of it was just a delay. "It's hard work in this cold," he said instead. "I know it," she said. "I've been here long enough." They worked the east fence line on a Saturday, starting at first light and going until the short November afternoon gave out. It was 500 yards of fence that had gone without serious maintenance for longer than one season. Posts leaning, rails split, a section near the creek crossing where the whole line had shifted when the spring melt undermined the ground, and nobody'd had time to reset it properly. Rowena dug holes and tamped posts while Brenner cut and fitted rails, and they traded off when one job got ahead of the other, working in the particular wordless efficiency of people who've gotten used to how the other person moves. It was cold enough that they had to warm their hands every 20 minutes or so. She learned to tuck her right hand into her armpit when it went numb, feel the blood come back, then go again. At some point in the mid-afternoon, working on a section near the property corner, she looked up and saw Harlan Croft on horseback on the far side of the fence line, maybe 30 yards off, watching them. He was just sitting there on a well-kept bay horse, still as a man who's very comfortable with being watched watching. When she looked at him, he nodded, once, a greeting that wasn't quite a greeting. Brenner was a few yards down the line, his back to Croft. Rowena straightened and kept her eyes on Croft and didn't call out to Brenner. She wanted a moment to see what Croft would do. He sat a while longer. Then he touched the brim of his hat, turned the horse, and rode back toward his own property without having said a word. "Brenner," she said. He looked up. She tilted her head in the direction Croft had gone. Brenner looked. Nothing there now but the flat brown grass of the east field and the fence line running straight toward the horizon. "Was he there?" Brenner said. "Just watching," she said. "Didn't come over." Brenner looked at the fence they'd been working on, the new posts, the straight rails, the line that was closed now for the first time in who knew how long. "Good," he said, and went back to work. She went back to work too, but she carried the image of Croft on his bay horse for the rest of the afternoon, the stillness of him, the patience. Men like that were never just looking. They were measuring, assessing, waiting. She'd seen that kind of waiting before, not in landmen, but in creditors and bankers and the various figures who orbited failing enterprises. And she knew what it meant. It meant he thought there was still a chance the land would come to him. It meant he wasn't done. She hammered the last post of the day into the frozen ground with more force than was technically necessary and said nothing about what she was thinking. That night she couldn't sleep. It wasn't unusual. She'd never been a reliable sleeper, and the events of the day had a way of reassembling themselves in the dark with more clarity and less mercy than they had in daylight. She lay in the narrow bed listening to the wind and going through numbers and fence lines, and the look on Harlan Croft's face and the tightness of the account at Aldert's, and after a while she gave up on sleep and got up and went to the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with cold coffee and her notebook when she heard Brenner's boots in the hall. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her. He was in his work shirt, his hair unsettled, the look of someone who'd been lying awake and gotten tired of it. "You too," she said. "Yeah." He went to the stove and found the coffee was cold and stood there for a moment deciding whether to reheat it or not. He decided not and poured it anyway and sat down across from her. They sat in silence for a while. The wind moved around the house and the stove ticked. "Tell me about the spring plan," he said. "The garden. What you were thinking." She looked at him. It was an unusual request, not about immediate problems, not about numbers, something further out. "The lower beds, closest to the creek," she said after a moment. "That's where I'd put the potatoes. Vera says they do well in this valley if you get them in early enough. And the squash seed from the barn, there's enough there for a good plot if the ground's prepared right." She paused. "The kitchen garden? What Margaret had? I'd keep that for the household vegetables, the beans and greens, but the lower field could be producing food we could actually sell, not just keep." He was listening. She could see he was really listening, not waiting for her to finish, but actually taking it in. "My father had a kitchen garden," she continued. "My mother ran it mostly. She used to say it was the difference between eating and eating well." She stopped, aware she'd gone somewhere she hadn't meant to go. "Rowena," Brenner said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you didn't turn around at the station," he said. It was so simple and so direct that it took her a second to find her way to answering it. "I'm glad I didn't either," she said. The wind shifted outside and the stove ticked once more, and they sat there in the kitchen in the middle of the night with cold coffee going warm in their hands, not saying anything else, and it was enough. It was, she thought, exactly enough for where they were. She went back to bed eventually. She slept. The ranch was still struggling. The account was still thin. Harlan Croft was still watching from the east. Winter still had months of itself left to spend. But something had shifted in the weight of the thing. Some load redistributed between two people who had quietly, without ceremony, decided to carry it together. She felt it in the morning when she built the fire, and when she counted 6 eggs from the coop and then 7, and when Brenner came in from the barn with ice on his coat and accepted a cup of coffee from her hand without either of them making anything of it. Just 2 people in the same kitchen, just that. It was not nothing. On a winter ranch in Colorado, 4 miles from a town and a long way from certain, it was not nothing at all. December came in without ceremony and settled over the valley like something that intended to stay. The snow that had been threatening since Rowena's first week finally arrived in earnest on a Sunday night. She heard it begin while she was still awake, the particular hush that precedes heavy snowfall, the way the wind drops and the world goes quieter than it has any right to be. By Monday morning, there were 8 inches on the ground and more coming, and the mountains had disappeared entirely behind a wall of white that stretched from horizon to horizon. She was dressed and in the kitchen before Brenner's boots hit the hall floor, the fire already built up and the oats on, moving through the morning routine that had, by now, become something she didn't have to think about. That was its own kind of progress, the stage beyond learning, where a thing becomes part of the body's knowledge rather than the mind's. Brenner came in looking at the snow through the window, the way a man looks at an opponent he's seen before. "Deep," he said. 8, 9 inches, Rowena said. "More before noon, the way the sky looks." "I need to check the cattle. The youngest ones don't do well when it comes this fast." "I'll get the barn after breakfast," she said. "You check the herd." He started to say something, probably something about her not needing to, and then he stopped, because they'd had that conversation enough times by now that he knew how it ended. They ate quickly. Brenner was out the door before the dishes were cleared, pulling his coat on as he went. Rowena washed up and then pulled on her own layers. The heavy wool coat, the scarf she'd learned to double around her face after the first serious cold, the gloves that were starting to wear through at the right thumb. She added the gloves to the list in her head and went out into the white. The barn needed its morning work done in spite of the weather, maybe more so because of it. The horses were restless. They could smell the weather, and it made them stupid in the particular way of animals who know something is wrong but can't do anything about it. She talked to them while she worked, not in baby talk, just in the steady conversational tone she'd found kept them calmer than silence did. The bay mare, whose thrown shoe had kept Brenner from the station that first day, had developed a trust in Rowena over the weeks that showed itself in small ways. She stopped tossing her head when Rowena picked up her feet to check them, which she'd done religiously with every horse, the mare included. She was distributing the morning hay when she heard Brenner coming back across the yard faster than his usual pace. She came to the barn door and watched him. His face told her before he said anything. "How many?" she said. "The 2 youngest aren't good. They were huddled up against the north wall of the pasture, not moving much. I got them into the lower pen, but—" He shook his head. "They didn't winter well last year either. They're not strong animals." "Are they down?" "Not yet. Standing. But their coats are rough, and they're not responding the way they should." She thought fast, running through what she knew and what they had. "Is there dry straw in the lower pen?" "Some." "I need more than some. Pack it. Deep bedding. It'll hold heat." She was already moving. "Is there any feed supplement left, the kind we've been giving the stronger animals in hard weather?" "Half a bag." "Split it. Give some to those 2. Save the rest." She picked up the pitchfork. "I'll come." They worked the lower pen together in the thin morning light, Brenner piling straw, while Rowena got a close look at the 2 young cattle, both of them third-year animals, smaller than the others, with the slightly sunken hip look of animals that hadn't quite gotten enough nutrition going into winter. Not lost yet, but close enough to the edge that a bad night could take them. "The one on the left," she said, crouching beside the smaller of the 2, running her hand along its spine. "She's thin. She was thin going in?" "Thinner than I wanted," Brenner said. He was pitching straw and not looking at her, but she could hear something in his voice that was part guilt. "I thought she'd manage." "You had 19 animals and no help," Rowena said. She said it without softness and without hardness, just as a fact. "You couldn't watch all of them the way they needed watching." He didn't answer. She knew he was blaming himself in the private way that men who've been alone with responsibility too long tend to do. Quietly, constantly, without ever quite putting it down. "They have a chance if the weather doesn't get worse," she said. "Keep them penned, keep them packed in, make sure they're eating, check them twice a day." "I know." "Brenner." She stood and looked at him. He met her eyes. You still have 17 solid animals. That's not nothing. He leaned the pitchfork against the wall. His face in the cold morning light was tired in a way she recognized. Not the productive tiredness of hard work, but the heavier kind. The kind that comes from watching something that was supposed to get better get harder. No, he said. It's not nothing. Told. The two young cattle made it through the worst of the December snow, which was its own small miracle, though Rowena would not have called it that. She would have called it 40 hours of careful management, twice daily checks and temperatures that made the walk from house to barn feel like a punishment, and the half bag of supplements stretched further than it had any right to go. By the end of the week, both animals were eating on their own and holding their weight. The smaller one would probably always be a marginal animal, not worth much at market. But she was alive, and alive counted. The snow settled in and the days shortened, and the ranch contracted around them. They didn't go to town for 2 weeks. The road was passable, but difficult, and everything they needed they either had or did without. Rowena found herself grateful, in those weeks, for the root cellar inventory she'd done in November. The pickled beets and dried apple rings came into their own. She made a soup from the stored turnips and dried beans that Brenner ate 2 bowls of without comment, which she took as high praise. She learned things about him in those enclosed weeks that she wouldn't have learned in easier circumstances. She learned that he actually read, not just owned books, and that he read slowly and carefully, going back to passages, sometimes moving his lips slightly with difficult sentences. He was working his way through a book on practical geology that had apparently been sent by a brother in Pennsylvania. She found him with it more than once in the evenings after the day's work was done. She learned that he had a brother. She learned that they wrote infrequently. She learned that he had a temper, or the edge of one. Not a violent thing, nothing directed at her, but the kind of temper that lives in a jaw muscle and a pair of hands. She saw it once when a fence repair went wrong for the 3rd time, the post refusing to set in the frozen ground, and he stepped back and stood very still for a long moment before he went back to it. She said nothing. She'd learned to read the difference between the moment a person needs to be left alone and the moment they need something said. She learned that he had not touched the things in Margaret's garden shed since she died. This she discovered by accident, opening the wrong door on the side of the house one afternoon, looking for a hand tool she thought she'd seen. The shed was small and dim and had the particular quality of a space that has been sealed against grief. Everything in its place: a trowel hanging on a nail, seed packets in an organized row, a pair of worn leather gloves folded on the potting shelf. She closed the door without touching anything and didn't mention it. What she learned about herself in those weeks was harder to name. She learned that she was capable of more patience than she'd thought. Not the patience of someone who didn't care, but the harder kind, the patience of someone who cared and waited anyway. She learned that she could be alone in a room with a person she was coming to know and feel less alone than she had in months of actual solitude. She learned that the act of feeding someone, of watching a person eat something she'd made and seeing their body accept the fuel of it, still gave her a satisfaction she couldn't entirely explain. She learned that she'd started to think of the ranch as theirs, not hers. She had no illusions about what she owned and what she didn't, legally or practically, but hers in the sense that mattered to her, the sense of investment, of effort laid down, of a place that carried her work in it. One evening in the 3rd week of December, she was rereading a letter she'd gotten in the last mail before the road closed, from her cousin in Missouri, the one she hadn't spoken to in years, who had somehow heard about the arrangement and written to ask if she was safe. The letter was brief and slightly formal, the way letters are between people who were once close and don't know what distance has made of them. Rowena read it twice and then folded it. "Bad news?" Brenner said. He was across the room with his geology book. "No, my cousin in Missouri, checking on me." "What did you tell her?" Rowena looked at the folded letter. "I haven't answered yet." "What will you tell her?" She thought about it. "That I'm well," she said, "that the work is hard, that it's the right place." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the book. Then, "Is it?" She looked at him. He was still looking at the page, but he wasn't reading. "Yes," she said. He turned a page, though she didn't think he'd finished the one before it. January brought a week of temperatures that made December feel mild by comparison. The stove ran all night, every night, and she woke each morning to check it before anything else. The water in the kitchen bucket froze from the stove. The hens stopped laying entirely for 8 days, which she'd expected. Even with the supplement and the packed straw, their bodies had a limit, and then resumed on a Sunday morning, 3 eggs, which she considered an act of stubbornness on the hen's part that she could only admire. Brenner spent those weeks doing a thing she hadn't expected, salvaging. He'd found somewhere in the back of the barn a cache of old fence nails, bent ones, pulled from rotted wood, the kind most people would discard. He'd brought them inside in a coffee tin and spent his evenings straightening them on the kitchen table with a hammer and a flat iron, working by lamplight with a focus she found almost startling in its patience. He didn't explain it and she didn't ask, but she watched him do it for several evenings before she said anything. "How many do you have?" she said. He counted. "Close to 200, straightened. Maybe another 100 still to do." "Enough for the west section?" He looked up. "You've been thinking about the west section? The rails there are going. 2 more hard winters and they'll need replacing. If you have the nails, you save the cost of buying them." He looked at the tin of straightened nails and then at her with the expression she'd started to recognize, the one that appeared when she'd said something that confirmed a suspicion he'd had about her. "That's why I'm straightening them," he said. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to know how many we have." He almost smiled. Not quite. Brenner Vale's face was not built for easy smiling, she'd learned, but something in the set of it changed, the line of his mouth shifting slightly towards something warmer. "Enough," he said, "if we're careful." "We're always careful," she said, and went back to her own work. The salvage work became something she joined when her evenings allowed it, sitting at the kitchen table across from him, working through the bent nails with their own methodical pace, the lamp between them, the stove doing its best against the January cold. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they did. She told him about Kansas, about her father's farm before it was lost, about the particular quality of flat country sky that she still sometimes missed, even though she'd come to find the mountains necessary. He told her about coming to Colorado, how he and Margaret had done it, the whole journey west in '81, the land they'd claimed, the first 2 winters that had nearly ended it before it properly began. "She was braver than me," he said one evening. He said it without self-pity, just as a plain fact. "About the uncertainty. I'd get into a bad stretch and she'd—" He paused, turning a nail over in his hands. "She'd just keep going, like it didn't occur to her to stop." Rowena thought about that. "Some people are made that way," she said. "Are you?" She considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I don't think so," she said. "I think I'm made for stubbornness. It's different. Brave people don't mind the fear. Stubborn people just refuse to let it make the decision." He looked at her across the lamp. "You're describing yourself very practically," he said. "I'm a practical person." "I know." He picked up another nail. "I've noticed." There was something in the way he said it, not critical, not even neutral, but something closer to the way you'd say a thing you'd been considering for a while and decided you could say out loud. She looked at the nail she was holding and didn't say anything else. And the fire ticked in the stove, and the wind did what wind does in January, and they sat there working in the lamplight until it was too late to be awake. Harlan Croft came to the ranch on a Tuesday in late January. Rowena saw him first. She was at the kitchen window when he rode up. The same bay horse, the same good coat, riding easy in the cold like a man who owned enough land that winter was someone else's problem. She watched him tie the horse at the post and come up the porch steps, and she felt something harden in her that she didn't examine closely. She got to the door before he knocked. He looked slightly surprised to find her there, which she suspected was the point. "Mrs. Pike," he said, which told her he'd been getting information about the ranch from somewhere. "Mr. Croft," she said. "Is Brenner in?" "He's in the barn." She didn't move away from the door. "Is there something I can help you with?" Croft looked at her for a moment with the patient look of a man who didn't find women obstructing his business particularly unusual. "I'd like to speak with Brenner directly, if it's all the same." "Of course," Rowena said, stepping back to let him in. "I'll get him." She went through the kitchen and out the back and crossed to the barn, where Brenner was working on the harness. She told him simply, Harlan Croft is in the house. Brenner went still for a moment. Then he hung the harness on its hook and came with her. She did not stay in the kitchen. She busied herself at the stove, which gave her a reason to be in the room, and neither man commented on it. Croft was pleasant. That was what she noticed most. He had the ease of a man who'd never had to be unpleasant to get what he wanted. He asked about the winter, about the cattle, about the fence work they'd done on the east line. Brenner answered in monosyllables, standing with his back to the window, his arms at his sides. And then Croft said, with the same casual pleasantness, "I know the account at Aldert's has been thin. I've got no interest in making things harder for you, Brenner. What I do have is a fair offer for the lower 40, if you're finding it more than you can manage." The lower 40 was the best part of the ranch. The creek-fed section, the one she'd been planning the potato beds for. Rowena kept her eyes on the stove. "I'm not selling," Brenner said. "I'm not pressuring," Croft said. "Just letting you know the offer stands. A man in your position." "I know my position," Brenner said. His voice was level. She could hear the jaw muscle thing in it, the held-back quality. "I appreciate you riding out, Harlan, but I'm not selling any part of this land." Croft looked around at the kitchen then. His eyes moved across the stove, the table, Rowena's notebook still open on the counter, the careful order of a room that had been organized and was being managed. His eyes found Rowena briefly. "You've made some improvements," he said. "We have," Brenner said. The word "we" sat in the room like something solid. Croft heard it. She could see him hear it. "Well," Croft said, picking up his hat, "spring's a long way off. Offer will keep." After he left, Brenner stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long moment without speaking. Then he sat down at the table, heavily, like a man putting down something he'd been carrying. "He'll come back," Rowena said. "Yes. He thinks the spring sale won't be enough." Brenner looked at his hands. "What do you think?" She thought about it honestly. "I think it'll be close," she said. "I think if we don't lose any more cattle, and if we can get them into decent condition before March, and if the price holds—" She paused. "I think it's possible. Not certain. Possible." "Possible," he said. "Possible is enough to work with," she said. "It's what we've had since November." He looked at her across the table. The winter light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table between them, thin and pale and entirely real. "Rowena," he said. Her name, just that. "I know," she said, because she thought she did. "I want to say something, and I'm not sure I know how to say it." She waited. "When I wrote that advertisement," he said slowly, I didn't think it would be like this. I thought it would be practical. A person to help with the work. Someone to keep the house." He stopped, looking for the next words. "I didn't think—" "Neither did I," she said, which was true, and which seemed to be enough to release something in him, some held breath. "I'm glad you're here," he said, "not because of the chickens, or the fence, or the root cellar." He looked at her steadily. "I'm glad you're here." The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the January light was doing its thin best through the window. And outside the mountains stood exactly where they'd always been, white and permanent and enormous. Rowena looked at Brenner Vale across the kitchen table, at his rough hands and his tired eyes and the particular quality of his face, which had changed in the weeks she'd been there, lost some of the closed-down flatness she'd first seen in it, and opened, just slightly, the way land opens after rain. "I know," she said again, and this time she meant something more by it, and he heard the more in it. And they sat there in the kitchen while the stove ticked and the winter light held as long as it could. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was two people at a table in January, in a house they were both trying to save, acknowledging something that had been true for a while and had been waiting for the right moment to be said. Outside, the snow held the shape of Harlan Croft's horse's hoofprints in the yard, already beginning to fill with the light powder that was drifting down from a pale sky. By morning, they'd be gone. Spring, Rowena thought. Spring was still a long way off. But it was coming. February was the longest month. It always was, on land like this. Not because of the calendar, which gave it fewer days than any other, but because of what it asked of you. By February, the initial determination of winter had worn down to something raw, a kind of bare endurance that didn't have the energy for anything beyond the next task and the next one after that. The cold was no longer a surprise. It was just the condition of life. the thing everything else had to be done inside of. Rowena knew this kind of month. She'd lived through enough of them in Kansas to understand that February on hard land was less about survival. You'd already proven you could survive. November through January had established that. And more about whether you could survive without losing something essential in yourself. Some people came through winter intact. Some came through it diminished, like a candle burned to the bottom of its wax, functional but reduced. She watched Brenner for signs of the second thing and didn't find them, which relieved her more than she would have admitted. He'd had several bad years before she arrived, years of doing this alone, and she'd half expected that February would show her the seams of whatever was holding him together. Instead, what she found was a man who worked with the same steady pace in February that he'd worked in November. Not cheerful, not performing optimism, just present and continuing. That was its own kind of strength, she thought. Not the loud kind, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. The salvaged nails were all straightened by mid-February. 263 of them, in the end, enough for the west fence section with some left over. Brenner had begun laying out the materials in the barn on a Sunday afternoon when the weather was too bad for outside work, organizing the new rails he'd cut from a downed pine on the north slope, cut and split over 3 separate days, hauled back on the sled by the 2 horses working together. The wood was good and dry and would last. "You're ready to go the moment the ground allows," Rowena said, coming into the barn to find him measuring rails. "No point in waiting," he said. She leaned against the stall door and watched him work. "The Aldert account," she said. "I've been going over the numbers again." He looked up. "If we sell 17 head at the spring market, assuming the 2 younger ones aren't worth putting in, and if the price is anywhere near what you got 2 years ago, we come out ahead of the debt." She paused. "Not by much, but ahead." He set the measuring rod down. "Define not by much. Enough to cover what's owed and have something left for seed and the summer feed supply. Not enough for anything else." She met his eyes. "But ahead is ahead." He was quiet, turning that over. She could see him doing the same arithmetic she'd already done, checking her work the way he did with anything important. Not because he doubted her, she understood now, but because that was how he respected something, by taking it seriously enough to verify it himself. "If the price holds," he said. "If the price holds. And if the 2 young ones can't go to market, then we're tighter," she said. "But still possible, the smaller one, the one from December, she's not going to be a strong animal. But she's alive, and that's better than I thought she'd be in January." She paused. "I think she makes it to spring. I don't know that she makes it to next winter." He nodded. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Croft's offer on the lower 40, Rowena said carefully. "What was the number?" Brenner told her. She already knew it was a fair number. Fair in the sense that it reflected the land's current value accurately, not generously. Croft wasn't a man who overpaid. That was how he'd gotten to where he was. "It's not enough to change things," she said. "Even if you took it, you'd cover the debt and lose the best section of the ranch and have nothing left to grow on. I know that. I just wanted to make sure we both knew it." He almost smiled. "You're very thorough." "I'm very afraid of making the wrong decision," she said, which was more honest than she'd intended to be, and surprised them both slightly. He looked at her for a moment. "You don't seem afraid of anything," he said. "I seem that way," she said. "It's different." The cattle went to market the second week of March. Brenner drove them with the help of a neighbor named Aldous Frey, a taciturn man in his 60s who ran a small sheep operation 3 miles east, and who appeared at the ranch at dawn on the appointed morning without being asked, which turned out to be simply how Aldous Frey operated. He knew when a neighbor needed an extra hand and showed up, and you paid him back in kind when his time came. Rowena fed him breakfast before they left, and he ate it with the thoroughness of a man who doesn't take a meal for granted, and said, when he was done, "Good biscuits," which, from Aldous Frey, Vera later told her, was practically a speech. She spent the day they were gone doing the things she'd been putting off, a thorough cleaning of the root cellar, now nearly empty, ready for the new season's storing. A full assessment of the seed she had on hand against what she'd need for the spring planting. She went through the kitchen garden beds in the afternoon, turning the soil with a fork where the freeze had compacted it, breaking the clods, feeling the ground's condition. Better than she'd hoped. The winter had been hard, but the soil was richer than Kansas soil, darker, more alive in the handful. She was in the garden when she thought about Margaret's shed. She stood there for a long moment with the fork in her hands, looking at the low door on the side of the house. Then she went to it and opened it, slowly, the way you open something that belongs to someone else. The gloves were still on the potting shelf, the trowel on its nail. The seed packets in their row. She looked at the dates on them without touching, reading them where they stood. Most were too old now, past their viability, the seeds inside exhausted by time. But there were 2 packets at the end of the row that were newer, dated in a hand that was careful and precise. Summer squash, 1884. 1 year before the fever, the seeds might still be good. Squash held longer than most. She stood there a while, in that small space that smelled of old earth and dried herbs, and the particular absence of someone who'd organized it with care. It was the first time she'd stood inside it, and she found it less painful than she'd expected. Not because grief had gone from it, but because the grief had a quality of love in it that she recognized. A woman who'd hung her gloves on a shelf and put her seeds in order had been someone who intended to come back and use them. That intention was still in the room, preserved somehow in the organization of things. She took the 2 seed packets. She held them carefully and went back to the garden and stood in the turned soil and looked at the mountains, which had been mountains through everything. Through Margaret's death and Brenner's grief, and the loss of Daniel, and 2 years of a man trying to hold on alone, and 4 months of 2 people figuring out how to do it together. Mountains didn't care about any of that. That was both the hardest and the most comforting thing about them. She put the seed packets in her coat pocket and went back inside to start supper. Brenner came back after dark. She heard the horses before she heard him. The particular sound of animals coming home tired, their hooves slower and more deliberate than the outward trip. She had supper on the stove and the lamp lit, and she waited. He came through the door with the specific look of a man who has been through a long day that ended well, which is a different look from a long day that ended badly. The eyes are the same tired, but there's something in the jaw, some release of held tension that tells you which one it was. "How did we do?" she said. He told her. The price had held. Better than held. One of the buyers from Denver had come up for the season and bid against the local buyers on 3 of Brenner's animals, driving the price up on those 3 specifically. The final number was better than what she'd calculated in the best-case version of her arithmetic. "Enough?" she said. "More than enough." He sat down at the table. He looked at the food on the stove and at her and back at the table. "We pay off Alderts and have enough left for seed, summer supplies, and—" He stopped. "And what?" "New gloves," he said. "Your right thumb's been through since January." She looked at her hand, the worn-through thumb. She'd been wrapping it in a scrap of cloth when the temperature dropped below a certain point. "That's what you noticed," she said. "I noticed in January," he said. "I just couldn't afford to say it." Something happened in her chest at that. Not dramatically, not the way the stories described it, no sudden heat or rush of anything. More like a weight shifting, settling into a different configuration. The ordinary small kindness of a man who'd been watching her cold thumb for 6 weeks and waiting until he could do something about it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it all the way down. Aldous Frey got a plate of supper before he went home, and he ate it with the same thoroughness as breakfast and said nothing at all when he left, which Rowena was beginning to understand was its own kind of warmth from him. She told Brenner about the seed packets over supper. She set them on the table between them and let him look at them without saying anything first. He picked one up. He looked at the handwriting, the careful, precise hand, and his face did the complicated thing it sometimes did, the thing she'd learned not to try to interpret too quickly. She waited. She had a whole system for the garden, he said eventually, which beds got which things. She'd rotate them every year so the soil didn't get tired. He turned the packet over. "I never learned it properly. I figured she'd always be the one who knew." "The squash might still germinate," Rowena said. "They hold a long time if they've been stored dry. I want to try." He looked at her. "If that's all right," she said. It was the first time she'd asked his permission for something in the garden, and she meant the question on more than one level, and they both understood that. "Yes," he said. "It's all right." He set the packet down on the table between them. She would have liked that, someone using them. Rowena nodded. She picked up the packets and put them back in her coat pocket for the morning. They ate the rest of the meal talking about the spring fence work, about the hay supply that would need replenishing before summer, about whether to try to add a few more hens to the flock now that the 10 remaining ones were consistently producing 8 eggs a day. Practical things. The things that the land asked of you continuously, without interruption, regardless of what else was happening in the human lives that worked. But underneath the practical things, the way a current runs under surface water, was the fact of that number from the cattle sale, which meant they'd made it through the winter, which meant Harlan Croft's offer could stay exactly where they'd left it, standing, unanswered, going nowhere. Spring came the way spring comes in Colorado. Not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm day followed by a cold one. The snow retreating from the south-facing slopes while the north-facing ones held their white for another 3 weeks. The creek running higher as the high country snowmelt started. The sound of it reaching the house on still mornings, a rushing constancy that was different from the winter silence. Rowena was in the garden on a Tuesday when Vera Aldert rode up. She didn't often come out to properties. She was a town woman, practical about the distances. So Rowena straightened and watched her come with some curiosity. Vera tied her horse and came to the garden fence and looked at what Rowena had done. The turned beds, the early peas that were showing the first thread-thin green shoots, the mounded rows where the potatoes were in. She looked at it for a long moment. Gus heard from the Frey boy that the cattle sale went well, Vera said. It went well, Rowena said. Vera looked at the garden. Margaret had it in this same arrangement, she said. More or less. I know. I've been going by what I could figure out from the beds. She paused. I found her seed packets in the shed, 2 of them, squash. I put them in the east bed. Vera was quiet for a moment. I gave her those packets, she said, the summer before. She looked at the east bed, where the soil was mounded over the seeds in their rows. Did they take? I think so. It's early to be sure, but the soil looks right above them. Vera nodded. She leaned on the garden fence with her arms crossed and looked at the whole of it, and then at the house, and then back at Rowena. The town's noticed, Vera said. The ranch. The difference. Rowena picked up her fork. What kind of notice? The good kind. People who've watched Brenner struggle for 3 years can see that something's different. Aldous Frey told Gus the cattle were in better condition than he's seen them in years. A pause. And Harlan Croft was asking questions in town last week. About the spring sale, about how the place was going. What did Gus tell him? Gus told him the account was paid in full. Vera's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did, a satisfaction she was too reserved to show outright. Gus doesn't like Harlan Croft very much. He's always very accurate with him. Rowena understood what that meant. Croft had been expecting the Vail account to be desperate. Instead, he'd found it cleared, and that information was now sitting with him wherever he was, requiring recalculation. He'll come back, Rowena said. Probably, Vera agreed. But it'll be harder for him to come with an offer now. A man who's just paid his debts isn't a man who needs saving. She looked at Rowena directly. That was well done. Rowena didn't say anything for a moment. She turned the fork over in her hands, looking at the turned earth, the early shoots, the seed mounds in the east bed. It wasn't one thing, she said. It was a lot of small things in the right order. That's how it always is, Vera said. People want it to be one thing. It never is. She stayed for an hour, and they talked about what grew well in this valley and what didn't, about the creek and how to use it for the kitchen garden in dry stretches, about the hens and what Vera had heard about a new feed supplier coming into the county that might bring prices down. Practical things, all of it. The kind of conversation that doesn't look significant but carries underneath it the quiet weight of one woman passing knowledge to another woman about how to hold on to a piece of ground. When Vera left, she paused at her horse and looked back at Rowena in the garden. He's better, she said. Brenner, you can see it. Rowena looked at her. I know, she said. Margaret would have been glad, Vera said simply, and rode back toward town. Croft came in April. Not to make an offer this time. He came with a boundary question, something about the creek easement on the east side, a property line that had apparently been disputed before Brenner even bought the land. It was the kind of visit designed to be reasonable on the surface while communicating something beneath it, and Rowena recognized the shape of it immediately. This time she sat at the table. Brenner let her, which was its own thing. A man who could have asked her to step out, or who might have assumed, out of old habit, that this was his business to handle alone. He didn't assume. He pulled out a chair and she sat in it, and Croft looked at her sitting there and adjusted something in his approach without visibly adjusting anything at all. The boundary conversation was exactly as pretextual as she'd expected. There was a question about where the creek easement ended and whether Brenner's fence on the east side had encroached slightly. A question that had apparently not bothered Croft at all during the years when Brenner was vulnerable, and which had surfaced now at some convenient interval after the debts were paid, which told you everything you needed to know about the question. "I have the original survey," Rowena said. Croft looked at her. "From when Brenner filed the land claim," she said. "I went through the house records when I arrived. The east fence line is 6 feet inside the original boundary, not on it." She kept her voice conversational. "We set it in deliberately, because posts set into hard frozen ground sometimes shift in the spring melt. The line itself isn't in question." Croft looked at her for a moment, then at Brenner, then back at her. "I wasn't suggesting it was," he said. "Good," Rowena said. "Then we agree." There was a silence of maybe 4 seconds that contained several entire conversations none of them were going to have out loud. Then Croft picked up his hat. "Place is looking well," he said, to the room generally. "It is," Brenner said. After he left, Brenner stood at the window and watched the bay horse carry Harlan Croft back down the road toward his own very large holdings, and then he turned around and looked at Rowena. "The survey," he said. "It's in the box since the bedroom," she said. "I found it in November. I've read it twice." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she was no longer uncertain about. It was not complicated, the expression. It was clear and direct and full of something that had been building since November, through the cold and the sick cattle and the salvaged nails and the February lamplight and the January night in the barn and everything else they'd done in the same direction. "Rowena," he said. "I know," she said. It had become a kind of language between them, those two words. She knew what he meant, and he knew she knew, and sometimes the knowing was enough to not need the saying. But this time he crossed the room. He stood in front of her and looked at her the way you look at someone when you've decided you're done being careful about what your face shows. And he said, "I want to make this a real marriage." She looked at him. His face, which she'd had 4 months to learn, was entirely open in a way she hadn't seen it before. Not vulnerable exactly, or maybe vulnerable exactly, but the kind of vulnerable that belongs to someone who has decided the risk is worth it. "It's been real," she said. "More real," he said. He stopped, and the slight awkwardness of it, the way he didn't have the smooth words for it, made her trust it more than smooth words would have. "I don't want it to be an arrangement," he said. "I want it to be a marriage." She looked at this man who had not met her train and had straightened nails by lamplight, and sat up all night in a cold barn for a single animal, and had said "we" to Harlan Croft, and noticed her worn-through thumb 6 weeks before he could do anything about it. "It already is," she said. He kissed her then, and it was not the movie's version of a kiss. It was hesitant for a half-second, the way first kisses are between adults who know what they're risking, and then it wasn't hesitant at all, and the kitchen was warm from the April sun coming through the window, and the chickens were making their mid-morning noise outside, and somewhere down the slope the creek was running high with snowmelt. She thought briefly about William. Not with grief, with something gentler, something like gratitude. A life that ended had shaped the person standing in this kitchen, and she didn't want to forget that. She didn't intend to. But she was also here, entirely here, in a way she hadn't been in a long time. Maybe in years. That was the thing about survival, she thought. It didn't guarantee you anything beyond the surviving. What you built after that, what you chose to reach for when the immediate crisis passed, that was yours to decide. Some people made it through the winter and stayed diminished. Some people made it through and found, in the space that difficulty had carved out of them, room for something they hadn't expected. The summer squash came up in May. Both varieties, 12 plants in the east bed, pushing out of the mounded soil in the particular determined way of things that have been waiting in the dark and are done waiting. Rowena was in the garden when she saw the first shoots, and she stood there for a longer moment than made practical sense, just looking at them. Then she went to find Brenner. He was on the roof of the chicken coop. They'd finally gotten to the repairs she'd noted in November, working their way through the spring list, the one that had been building since before she arrived. And he came down the ladder when she called, reading her face before she said anything. "The squash," she said. He came to the garden and looked at the east bed. 12 small shoots, green against the dark soil, arranged in the rows she'd planted them. Margaret's seeds, he said. Margaret's seeds, she agreed. He stood there looking at them for a while. She stood beside him. The mountains were doing what they did in May, losing their winter white from the lower slopes while the high peaks held it, the line between snow and green moving upward week by week as the season took hold. She would have made something good with them, he said. So will we, Rowena said. He reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, just reached over and took it, the way people who have gotten used to each other do, like it's the most ordinary thing and also like it matters, both at once. They stood in the garden with the mountains behind them and the creek running in the distance and the 12 shoots of Margaret's squash coming up in the east bed, and the ranch around them was not perfect. The west fence still needed 2 more sections. The barn roof had a soft spot she'd been watching since March. The smaller of the 2 young heifers was still a marginal animal and might not make another winter. None of it was finished. None of it would ever be entirely finished, because land didn't work that way, life didn't work that way, and anyone who expected otherwise was setting themselves up for a particular kind of disappointment. But the fences held. The chickens were giving 10 eggs a day. The cattle were in better condition than they'd been in years. The account at Aldert's was clear. The garden was in and growing, and the east bed carried something that had survived longer than it had any right to. And there were 2 people standing in it, hands joined, not saying anything because nothing needed saying. That was what winter costs you, Rowena thought. Not just the cold and the money and the exhaustion and the fear, but the version of yourself that went in. You come out different. Smaller in some ways, bigger in others, with a clearer sense of what you actually need versus what you thought you needed. And a clearer sense of who you are when everything easy has been stripped away. She'd gone into that winter with 2 bags and a borrowed mule and a dead husband's debts, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided that giving up was not something she was going to do. She'd come out with calloused hands and a notebook full of crossed-off problems, and a ranch that was starting to breathe again, and a man standing beside her in the spring morning, holding on. You couldn't plan for that. You couldn't advertise for it or arrange it or guarantee it with a correspondence agency and 3 letters. It had happened the way real things happen, slowly, without announcement, through the accumulated weight of difficult days and shared work and small acts of attention that nobody would ever write down, because they were too ordinary to seem important, and yet were, in the end, the whole of it. That was the thing she'd carry from this place, she thought, no matter what came next, that the ordinary was the whole of it. The salvaged nails and the eggs counted, and the cold coffee at midnight, and the hand steadying you on an icy path. The life was made of that. Not the big moments, not the crises survived, not the spring after the terrible winter, but the 10,000 small decisions to keep going, to pay attention, to show up for the work and for the person beside you doing the same. The squash would be ready in August. She was already thinking about what to do with it.